Episode 26. Bessy is really like someone. Nevertheless, a few members of the student union were surprised and very excited. Anne, do you want to play this for the school Founders Day? This sounds amazing. I thought that the song was placed on the school Founders Day program and that it was already fixed. Anne pursed her lips. I'm trying to find a mentor using this song. I composed it myself. Really? Everyone present was in awe and envy. Only Kenneth was a little hesitant. Anne's playing was great, but it seemed to be missing something. He frowned and could not say anything. What do you think? Anne asked him. Kenneth snapped out of his thoughts. It sounds really good. Once Anne was done practicing, she went to the cafeteria to eat with Kenneth. Since class had ended late, Bessy stayed behind in the classroom for a while. It rained quite heavily. The rain and fog made everything misty and even the buildings nearby looked blurry. Mary talked to Riley about a poster, and they left together with Riley carrying an umbrella. She originally wanted to get an umbrella from the dormitory, but after seeing Scarlett at the doorway of the classroom, with a black umbrella in hand, Mary smiled and informed Bessy. At this time, the five of them shared two umbrellas as they walked across the schoolyard. It was not noisy and mostly quiet. The school's medical office. As it suddenly rained, few people were in there now. Samuel leaned back on his chair, propped both his legs up and tapped his fingers on the table. He turned to look at Michael. Michael, Robert Soup wants to see you. Michael was currently analyzing a rare illness. In response, he coldly turned a page and lazily replied without looking up. I will not see him. The operation was already over, so there was no reason to see him. Knowing that Michael was usually impatient with these things, Samuel was not surprised. Looking outside the door, he said in concern, It's raining so heavily, I wonder if Bessy brought an umbrella with her. She just recovered from a fever. Michael paused and could not help but raise his head. The door of the school's sick bay was still open, because Bessy had not arrived. Just as he spoke, they saw two people walking towards them. The girl who was holding an umbrella had short hair and wore glasses, so her face could not be seen clearly. She was actually quite attractive, but looked a little boring compared to the girl beside her. Michael did not notice that his eyes were focused on the girl beside her. She was indifferent and cool. Her remarkable eyes were vivid in the fog, and as bright as a landscape painting. Bessy had not spoken to Charlotte during their short walk. When she walked into the sick bay, Scarlett turned around to walk to the cafeteria. Looking at Scarlett from behind, Samuel noticed that she was quite thin. He could not help but turn around and ask, Bessy, is that your classmate? Why don't you ask her to sit down? Look, her clothes are all wet. She has no time and needs to rush back to study. As her school jacket was wet, Bessy took it off. Samuel remarked, What a nerd. Michael went over to the thermostat on the wall and raised the temperature by a few degrees. He continued to look at the case, but could not focus. In the residual light from the adjoining kitchen, he saw Bessy. He appeared expressionless, but was actually quite irritable. She was very unhappy and her body language also showed that she was upset. Michael continued to look at his case. He leaned on the sofa and turned the pages carelessly. These past 2 days, the three of them had developed a difficult relationship. Even after putting aside their differences, Samuel did not feel defensive against Bessy. When Michael said that there was a shortage of people, Samuel did not stop him. At this time, Samuel invited Bessy to stay for dinner, and Bessy could not reject him. There were too many people in the cafeteria, and she rarely went there. She usually went out to look for cafes with few people, as the crowded ones were time-consuming. As they were eating, Michael slightly shifted his feet. He saw that she looked distressed and could not help but ask, What's wrong? Oh, Bessy responded. The girl who was usually cool seemed out of character. She narrowed her eyes. There's a parent-teacher meeting this Saturday, but my grandmother is still in the hospital. Samuel originally wanted to say something, but he suddenly remembered Grace Smith. Bessy lowered her head and continued to eat quietly. Michael looked at her for a while and could not help but smile. He usually looked indifferent, though his smile sometimes caused others to feel stressed. But as he smiled now, his eyes were clear, like melted snow. It's not like your teacher knows your family, he said. Samuel generously said. "Bessy, I can be your dad." Bessy swallowed and took a sip of water. She looked at Samuel and considered this possibility. "You're too young to be my dad." "I can be your brother. It's settled then." Samuel straightened his clothes and was very pleased with himself. Then he asked, "Is that student you were with in the same class as you?" Michael looked at him expressionlessly. Bessy and Samuel continued the discussion for a long time until they finished eating. Bessy said goodbye and left for the dormitories to study. After she had left, Samuel suddenly felt Michael's gaze. Michael's face was picturesque and kind. "Why haven't I seen Samuel, the resolute man, so enthusiastic before?" Samuel thought for a moment, scratching his head. "Oh, Michael, Bessy is quite attractive, and I was drawn to her when I saw her. However, I really don't feel that way about her." He was not daring enough. Bessy had spoken quite matter-of-factly. There was no one to take her to the parent-teacher meeting on Saturday. However, Samuel felt an inexplicable sadness. He had never cared about other people's feelings before, but during the past few days that Bessy was here, he did not mention her family at all. Michael had initially asked casually, but after hearing this response, he recomposed himself and pondered slightly. "Continue talking." Samuel was quiet in contemplation and looked away. "I just think that I feel an inexplicable closeness to her. How about we threaten her mother together since I have the time after eating?" "Closeness?" Michael's face darkened and continued laughing. No." Samuel stood up as if a light bulb lit up in his head. "I think she's like—" He pondered about it and suddenly thought about someone. "Like my mother, Michael." Samuel exclaimed this but didn't explain anything to Michael. He had said she was like his mother casually, of course, but Samuel couldn't remember where the specific sense of familiarity came from. Michael continued to look at him expressionlessly. His eyes were dark and brooding, but Samuel's head was about to explode. He cleaned up the bowls that the three of them had eaten from. "Then, Michael, I have to wash the plates?" Michael retracted his gaze and nodded. His emotions couldn't be heard, and Samuel breathed a sigh of relief in the kitchen. He was still thinking about it, pondering over where the familiarity had come from. The Smith family. Anne had been practicing the violin these 2 days, familiarizing herself with the melody. Elise lived in Evanston. Anne knew what status her aunt's married family had in Evanston. Although the Smith family was considered a wealthy family in Chicago, they weren't worth a mention in Evanston. Since she had this opportunity, she had to seize it no matter what. Besides attending school and sleeping, Anne ate quickly and was practicing in the music room for most of the day. Downstairs, Thomas had come back later in the day, finding Anne absent as he ate. Grace smiled. "Anne is practicing in the music room. I'll take dinner over to her later. She has improved a lot recently." Thomas didn't expect her to work so hard, but he had also heard Elise mention the violin teacher in Evanston, so it wasn't too surprising. After eating, he went to study on the second floor. The door of the music room wasn't closed. When he passed by, he heard a low voice come from inside. He had heard the violin played by Anne, but he had never heard this melody before. He paused to listen. Anne put down her violin, looked up and found Thomas standing outside the door. She was a little surprised. "Thomas, why are you back?" Thomas shoved his mobile phone in his pocket, smiled softly and said with a gentle voice, "Anne, your violin skill has made a lot of progress. Just use less emotion and practice more." He had played the violin since a young age. Because he knew music as well, he rarely praised her. At most, he would only nod and say it was not bad if she asked. This was the first time her brother had praised her. Anne pursed her lips and then smiled. "Thank you, Thomas. This is a song I composed myself, but it needs improvement. Do you have some time to give some feedback?" "Yourself? You composed it yourself?" Thomas was a little surprised. The song was cold and dark, and the structure was also a little big. It didn't seem to suit Anne. Anne nodded. "It just needs improvement." "It needs to be changed. The entire style doesn't suit you. Give me your music and I'll take a look." Thomas looked at Anne in surprise. "But it's impressive." Finally, he couldn't help but praise her. Anne just tilted her head and smiled. The next day, in the second class in the morning, Bessy accompanied Mary and Riley to get colored chalk from the teacher's supply closet. In high school, too few people were willing to engage in the classroom bulletin board. Because Tuesday to Wednesday was too tight a time, Mary only found Riley as a companion. Riley was in charge of painting, and time was short. While going to get colored chalk, Mary had asked Bessy to go with them to gather supplies. At the same time, Abigail had also gone to the office to get English papers. It so happened that Anne was holding chemistry papers. So, Abigail waited for Anne to walk together with her. When they were in the corridor, they saw Bessy and Mary downstairs, walking from one building to the other. Thinking of what happened yesterday and how Paul had yet to come find her, Anne pursed her lips and asked, seemingly nonchalantly, "How's Paul's relationship with your class's new student?" "Bessy?" At the mention of this, Abigail's expression changed quickly. Paul covers for her too much. Nobody dares to go against Bessy in class. From the big jar of lollipops incident last time to Paul wanting to put Layla and the others in place, their English class didn't dare to even talk about Bessy. Oh. Anne hadn't expected it and didn't have any expression on her face. She wasn't familiar with Paul and only knew him mainly because of Kenneth. She didn't know why Paul still followed behind Kenneth, even though he was obviously a second-generation rich kid. Anne knew Paul through Kenneth. At this time, she didn't know what to say and remained silent. Abigail saw that Anne was still staring after Bessy and the others, lowered her head and pouted as well. Her tone was sour as she said, "That's our class bulletin board that nobody was willing to do. Mr. Scott found Mary and Riley also knows how to draw. I don't know why Bessy is there with them. What does she even know how to do? She writes and draws terribly. I just hope she doesn't ruin our bulletin board." Episode 27. Look back. Anne was listening while her thoughts flew. They had 2 days to finish up the bulletin board, and the first theme was regarding the high school entrance examination. Mary wrote well. She used her spare time to post the content. Riley would then paint it. On Tuesday, Mary used noon for self-study, and there was time for self-study during class too. She wrote almost everything and left a blank space for Riley to paint. At noon on Wednesday, Riley drew a little and waited for self-study at night to do the rest. They studied from 6 till 10 in the evening. 4 hours was enough. By the end of the evening, more than half of the board was still blank. Bessy sat on a stool and flipped through her books. She sat there leaning against the wall, lazily leaning on her chin, waiting for Mary to leave first. Before they both left, they saw Riley walking over. Mary put away her math papers and was very happy. "Riley, wait for me. I'll be done right away." In the past 2 days, she'd eaten dinner with Riley. Before she finished speaking, she saw Riley dip her head guiltily. "Mary, Bessy, I'm sorry, I can't continue to participate in the bulletin board anymore. Someone just notified me that the student union has a meeting and I must go there instead." Riley was an officer in the art department of the student union, which was considered official business. Mary also knew this, so she smiled forcefully. "It's all right." Who was going to create the artistic portion of their board now? After Riley left, she sat down on the chair, looking sadly at the blank spaces on the poster. Bessy, what should we do now?" If Riley had told her yesterday, Mary could have found someone else. But it was already nighttime, and some students weren't staying in the school and didn't attend self-study, so Mary wouldn't be able to find anyone. She was so annoyed. A girl from the front came over and lowered her voice. "Mary, have you offended Anne?" the girl whispered. Mary was angry and shook her head. She had reminded Bessy before that Anne mustn't be messed with, so how could she have committed that mistake? "How could I have?" "Then I don't know." The girl glanced at Mary. "When I went to the main building in the afternoon, I saw Anne asking Riley to help draw the student union's board poster. Anne had a good family background and her grades were good. Compared to Mary, it was easy to understand why Riley would choose to help Anne instead. Even though she knew this, Mary still frowned. Since she couldn't find anyone else to do the bulletin board, she would have to do it by herself. Bessy listened to the whole exchange. She stood up and frowned, her face shrouded in the shadows so that her expression couldn't be seen. "Go and eat first." Her voice was also light. Mary wasn't in the mood to joke around today, so she went to the cafeteria with what looked like a 1,000-pound weight on her shoulders. She walked almost 10 minutes to the cafeteria. Kenneth was having dinner with Principal White that night. He didn't go to the cafeteria and instead went back to the class to get his jacket. For some reason, the door of the class was unlocked. He walked towards the front door and saw that the front office was open as well. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a person standing at the bulletin board, drawing something on it. Kenneth stopped and squinted his eyes, glancing over coldly. Kenneth knew that the board had to be redesigned. He was still in the student union and would only hand over this role in the next semester. Tomorrow morning, he was going to rate the scores with several members of the student union. Kenneth looked at the stick figure on the bulletin board. The lines were simple and smooth, and cartoon characters had been drawn. They looked vivid and remarkably true to life on the board. Whoever had drawn these was creative and with a great eye for detail. Kenneth felt that the characters looked quite familiar, but he couldn't figure out who they were yet. The person drawing moved quickly across the board, seeming familiar with their characters. The characters were sketched out almost instantly. The coloring was also very bold, with colors blended masterfully together. This was based on real drawing skills, someone with real talent and experience. He never thought that he would see this level of drawing on a bulletin board. The person drawing had their back turned from him. She was leaning sideways, wearing black headphones on her ears, and the headphone cord swayed silently as she drew and danced to the music only she could hear. She took a step back as if to observe and critique her own characters. Kenneth stood quietly and unseen at the entrance of the classroom for a long time. When he stepped back, he saw her turn her face. She was absent-minded and playing with the headphone cable in one hand while she held chalk in the other. She admired her painting cynically. Her slightly squinted eyes were light and slow. Kenneth's heart trembled a bit in surprise. It was Bessy. Most of his understanding of Bessy was that she was a poor student with bad grades and with no desire to study. Her words looked like an elementary school student's, and during class, she was either lying on the table or holding an entertaining novel instead. She would not open her textbook, but she would read everything else, from fiction to foreign books to magazines. These were well known in English class. Kenneth took a step back, pursed his lips, and looked at Bessy as she turned to look for a different color of chalk. Instead of entering the classroom to get his jacket, he glanced at Bessy and silently walked back out of the building without a word. Kenneth found a black car on the side of the road next to the school and got in.
"Why did you take so long?"
asked Principal White. Kenneth turned back from the front seat and answered, "I went back to get something from my classroom." Principal White nodded and stopped speaking. They arrived at the Hotel Kennedy Grand. Kenneth excused himself to find a bathroom, while Principal White headed into the foyer. When Kenneth came out a few minutes later, he took the elevator up to the 20th floor, where he entered the main dining room. He didn't sit down first, but instead was surprised to see Michael and Samuel, who were sitting on either side of Principal White. He was stunned for a while before saying slowly, "Michael, Samuel?" Michael held a cup of coffee in his hand, and his long fingers squeezed the lid of the cup to let some steam out of the top, lazy and casual. Samuel didn't like drinking coffee and had asked for a glass of red wine instead. He was slightly surprised to see Kenneth. He raised an eyebrow. "I didn't know that Kenneth was also in Chicago." Michael wasn't very old, but he was the eldest son of Joshua Clark and had very high seniority in Evanston.
"I suggested that he transfer here."
Principal White let the waiter serve the dish and smiled slightly. There were probably some internal affairs of no consequence, so Michael just nodded and didn't probe into their personal matters. After half of the meal had been eaten, Michael leaned back in his chair and put his hands on the table.
"Principal White, I heard rumors from the school that you approved a recommendation for a young woman." "Yes, I did."
Principal White laughed and looked far away.
"More than one."
"More than one?" Michael played with the cup and raised an eyebrow.
"Let's not discuss this matter."
Principal White shook his head, apparently not wanting to say more. Michael didn't ask much, but Samuel couldn't help it. He took a sip of wine and asked,
"Principal White, who is the chosen successor you were talking about last time?"
Principal White shook his head at this and didn't speak. Samuel felt like he had just barely scratched the surface of something deeper and was full of curiosity, but since Principal White didn't want to reveal it, he didn't force him to either. Kenneth had been eating his steak and potatoes and couldn't participate in their dialogue. Only when Samuel mentioned his successor, he looked up suddenly at Principal White. He pursed his lips in disbelief, his fingers white and his knuckles raised. After the meal, Principal White and Kenneth left first. Samuel stayed with Michael for a while, sipping on their wine and coffee. The hotel manager, John Peterson, prepared a food container and gave it to Samuel to take home. When it was time to leave, the two men took the elevator down. At the door, Thomas entered with Jacob. The two wanted to talk about something. It just so happened that Elise and David also wanted to invite Jacob for dinner. As an investor in Thomas and the son of Mayor Grant, it was enough to make Elise and David cautious and respectful. Mayor Grant's style had always been very positive. However, he did not go out and eat with others very often, and the Grant family members were not easy to get close to either. With this opportunity, Elise and David both attached great importance to it. Jacob saw the two and was slightly shocked. He paused and greeted them.
Samuel, Michael,
respectfully. He wasn't in the Evanston circle, so he didn't address them further. Michael was used to prestige in Evanston, but he didn't speak at this time. Only Samuel answered him with a smile and a nod. He wasn't very familiar with Thomas either, so they just left after nodding in acknowledgement. After they had left, Thomas said,
"The two just now. Evanston's Clark family and Bright family."
Jacob lowered his voice. Thomas took deep breaths for a long while before regaining his breath calmly and expressing his understanding. He had been to Evanston before and knew that the city was full of opportunists, ready to leap at any chance to exploit and take advantage. The person walking casually on the road could be someone you couldn't afford to mess with. The Smith family was not worth a mention anywhere in the city. This was one of the reasons why Thomas insisted on starting a business. "Jacob! Oh, Jacob!" A light voice sounded. Anne had been waiting upstairs, and she went down to hold Thomas's arm and thoughtfully looked out the door. "Who did you just talk to?" She had just gotten off the elevator and had only seen the two men from the back. Jacob also nodded his head quite respectfully. That was Jacob, the Mayor Grant's son, the person even Thomas had to be careful of. "Two acquaintances." Jacob didn't say much to Anne and just smiled. He didn't want to reveal much more. Anne followed Jacob and Thomas up the elevator to the dining room. Upstairs, when he saw Lily Grant sitting next to Elise, Jacob was stunned.
"Mom?"
Lily rolled her eyes at him before smiling at Anne.
"Anne, come here. Come sit with me."
She obviously really liked Anne. Elise and David looked at each other in surprise. The next morning at Brightbow High School. As soon as Anne walked up to her English classroom, the sounds inside were almost explosive. It was early reading time, but the windows and doors of the class were surrounded by many students. Paul frowned. He kicked the door open and was very annoyed.
"It's so noisy."
"Oh, you, Paul, you're finally here." His classmate turned around and was very excited.
"What?"
Paul glanced over and smoothed his hair back. During the conversation, more and more people gathered by the window door. The boy lifted his chin to direct attention to the back of the room. His face flushed. "Look back! Look back!" At this time, members of the student union were taking their time to inspect the posters one by one, starting from the senior grade. "Kenneth, what's going on in your class?" Someone whispered to him. Anne seemed to be in a good mood. She smiled and followed behind Kenneth. She heard the buzz in the classroom and smiled. Maybe the bulletin board had been designed well. She walked into the classroom and pushed through the crowd of students. Episode 28. Who's the Artist? Bessy was very popular at school. She was individualistic and replaced Anne as the most popular girl in school the moment she arrived at Brightbow High School. Bessy was pretty, and news of her looks didn't just travel across Brightbow High School. Even students from the surrounding schools, including Baybridge High School, all skipped classes to come and see her. Pictures of Bessy were sneakily posted everywhere in school. Even so, her outstanding beauty was highly praised. Anne used to say that she didn't like anyone paying too much attention to her, but now that all of them were discussing Bessy, and even her status as the most popular girl in school had been taken away, she was in a bad mood. What did Bessy do to deserve this? She didn't study well and loved to fight. She had a bad attitude and exhibited all the behavior of bad students. Anne was very clear about the progress report of the English class's poster. She had gone to find Riley last night, so Riley didn't have time to draw anything. Almost everyone in English class had their heads tilted or were leaning against their chairs looking back. The smile on Anne's mouth didn't have time to expand. She saw the contents on the rear board and was dismayed. The people behind laughed and wanted to ask her why she didn't continue walking. When they saw the bulletin board, their eyes widened as well. Kenneth went to the student council early every morning and convinced the representatives of various departments for a meeting and then inspected each class. Yesterday, he had been in a hurry and had left without overseeing the complete process. Bessy had painted 2 very lifelike cartoon characters, one of which was colored. He didn't see the full version until now. Mary had divided the poster into 4 parts. She copied 2 poems and wrote a few high school senior inspirational quotes, leaving a blank space in the middle, which was the countdown to the college entrance examination. The remaining 4 blank spaces each had a cartoon character. There were 4 in total, from right to left. The first was in a white shirt and black slacks. Her hair was shredded, her face blushed, and she had a pair of beautiful and expressive eyes. The second was wearing a t-shirt, holding a microphone, and looking far away. The third was wearing a cotton jacket with a bandage on his arm. The fourth was in a punk outfit with overhead spotlights. It was like a growth history. The most shocking thing was that the entire blackboard was painted like a stage effect. The various chalks exactly depicted the spotlight, and all the famous poems and characters were perfectly embedded in it. In the bottom row, there were countless little white figures, probably only 1 finger high, holding light boards. Even though he had taken a glimpse yesterday, Kenneth was still shocked by this grand scene. The student union was silent collectively, and no one spoke. Ah, it's Noah Hyber. It's the process of his debut, and the last one is the costume he wore during the latest concert. My, Noah Hyber, he's so handsome. Oh my god, I'm transferring to English class. Noah Hyber was the craze now and was absolutely top 3 in the entertainment industry. The sound outside was endless. Almost all of them came out to take photos with their mobile phones, tweeted them, and posted them in school. Riley, you turned out to be a hidden fangirl. Impressive. I didn't realize it before, but you are my goddess as of today. Riley of English class was also surrounded. Riley had made a poster for the student union last night, and she had just entered the class. She was dumbfounded. No, I was in the student union last night. You can ask Mary and Bessy. Those people went to find Bessy and Mary instead. Bessy was lazily slouching on the table, flipping through a book. She was always in a bad mood when she got up in the morning. The look on her pretty face was cold. English class knew her temper, so no one dared to ask her anything, but that didn't prevent them from mentioning Bessy. Anne saw Paul kick off his chair and sit in front of Bessy's table. He tilted his head and seemed to want to ask her something. No fault at all. The head of functions waved his hand and was the first to announce this. Anne glanced at Kenneth again and saw that he had his head lowered and was writing, looking very serious. She gripped her pen tighter. Anne, you are too impressive. The head of functions gave Anne a thumbs up. How did you know the board in English class was this good? And you even wanted to come here first. Anne's face was completely ashen. English class was really noisy. Bessy put on her headphones expressionlessly, her eyebrows furrowed. What was going on with this group of students? She was wearing her school jacket, and her pure white face lifted slightly, as if looking out the window. The irritability at the bottom of her eyes burst out, determined to soar into the sky. Bessy. Mary covered her heart and reluctantly pulled her eyes from the poster at the back when the teacher came to maintain the order. She looked at Bessy. Who was this? Who could have drawn this? Who was it? Mary regained her senses and looked at Bessy, unable to contain her excitement. I don't know. Bessy lay her head down on the table impatiently. Mary whispered, Oh, and then said again, Bessy, you didn't do any work last night. She was very attentive and took her papers to Bessy to copy. Bessy got up again and held a pen with her left hand. She copied the paper, her eyes narrowed and cold and her expression irritable. English class became famous for this matter. Few people studied seriously, and all looked in Mary and Bessy's direction, whispering. Kenneth was flipping through his English books, and everyone around was discussing who painted the board. He couldn't help looking at Bessy. She was silent and indifferent. He wrote with his pen in his left hand very slowly. But Kenneth's hand paused. He remembered very clearly that she had used her right hand last night. Early morning classes were short. There were many people in English class. Kenneth went out to buy breakfast. Paul looked at Bessy lying on the table. She seemed to think it was noisy and covered her head with her school jacket. He touched his nose and went out with Kenneth. After early reading, more people came to English class, and there was no crowd in the corridor. They were either discussing the bulletin board or who painted it. Anne was waiting for them downstairs. She glanced at Paul walking beside Kenneth, but Paul didn't look at her and continued talking to Kenneth. I don't know who it is, Paul whispered. He put his hands in his pocket and cursed with a smile.
Bessy is always sleeping and ignoring me. I gave her a tin of candies for nothing.
Kenneth was silent. He had always been indifferent. Few people knew what he did at home, and nothing seemed to attract him. At the mention of Bessy, he raised an eyebrow. Anne stood aside and pursed her lips. Both of their reactions bothered her. She pretended to be relaxed. Whoever drew it is very impressive and probably isn't from our school. Otherwise, someone would have come out to claim it. That poster had indeed not been claimed, and Anne couldn't go against her conscience and say that it wasn't nice.
The person who painted it is a student in our school,
Kenneth suddenly said. Paul and Anne were both surprised. They stared at him silently. Kenneth's eyes were complicated.
She is Bessy.
Both Anne and Paul couldn't hide their expressions. Paul scratched his head and gave a low chuckle, except that his voice was a bit floaty.
Don't joke around.
Anne clenched her fingers. Subjectively, she didn't believe it at all. But this was Kenneth they were talking about. Other people might joke around, but he wouldn't. Kenneth's eyes were still, and he looked very calm. His lips were pursed, and he didn't speak. Paul was speechless now. Even Anne knew Kenneth wasn't joking, so how could he not know? At the cafeteria, Paul bought a box of soy milk, inserted a straw into it, and said after a moment,
"Is it really her?"
"Yeah." Kenneth bought a bowl of porridge, his expression still cold. Paul was completely speechless at this moment. Anne sat beside them and was ignored for the first time. She was even more confused in her heart. How could it be Bessy? How could it be her? The disposable fork in Anne's hands was almost deformed. Who the hell was Bessy? Her studies were going badly, and she didn't have any expertise other than fighting. In the past, besides the violin, she hadn't even attended any other interest classes. She had a weird personality, and not many people were willing to play with her. How could she draw? And so well, too. Anne always felt that Bessy was under her control, like she knew everything about her. But today, Anne found that, after having not seen Bessy for so many years, her knowledge of the girl was blank. Thinking of it, the disposable forks tightened again. She looked up and smiled casually. "I'll go practice the violin."
"Kenneth, I'll go find Bessy."
Paul stood up suddenly. Kenneth nodded, his eyes cold.
"Sure."
A group of people were gathered in English class, and Mary went out to buy breakfast. Paul was sitting on Mary's stool. Bessy was still sleeping. He reached out, poked her arm, and turned his head carefully to say,
"Did you draw it?"
"Paul." Bessy was still covered in her school jacket. Her voice was a little hoarse, and her tone was low.
"Don't make noise."
She was reluctant to say more, and Paul remembered that usually when the class was noisy, she would frown. Thus, he immediately zipped his mouth. As soon as he turned, he noticed more and more people in the class. It was like a vegetable market, so noisy that it caused a headache. He kicked the table across the aisle. Squeak! A very rough and harsh sound. The crowd quieted, and Paul put a hand on the table and looked at them sideways.
"Be quieter."
Subsequently, their voices gradually decreased. Episode 29. Parent-Teacher Meetings. It was already a convention between these students not to provoke Bessy. Bessy lay down for a while, and the noises in her ears disappeared, so she took the school jacket off her head and took a breath of fresh air. She sat on the chair with her knees pressed to the table, leaning against the back wall.
"That drawing."
Paul glanced at her. At this angle, he could clearly see her thick, dense, long eyelashes, and Paul thought to himself that the students were right to give her the nickname, Eyelash Essence. "It was me, but don't tell anyone." Bessy thought about it and frowned again. She could imagine just how long she would be watched like a monkey every day if those students knew.
"Shit."
Paul was silent for a moment, then he stiffened and said,
"Why did you draw Noah Hyber? Do you like him?"
"Who likes that stuff? It's Mary who likes him." Bessy hugged her arms and leaned against the wall. She looked annoyed at the noise and was dispirited, but even that didn't hide her delicate face.
"I understand."
Paul laughed. At Brightbow High School, 7 out of 10 students were Noah Hyber fans. It was the first time Noah Hyber had been referenced to as that stuff. The person who had drawn the board still wasn't known to most. The forum at Weibo had been discussing it for 2 days, to no avail. No one came out to claim it, and no one could identify who it was. But it didn't hinder Bessy's popularity in the slightest. Mary had been responsible for the board, and the English class could see how attentive Mary had been to Bessy for the past 2 days. Because of this, Bessy's popularity in English class and in the school rose another degree. Not only did it spread all over the 12th graders, but even the freshmen knew that there was a legendary popular girl named Bessy. They all wanted to see her, but they didn't dare come to the 12th graders' building. Bessy left school in the afternoon and took her thermos cup to the school hospital.
What's going on with the students these days? Forget about the girls probing their brains about this kind of thing. But the boys too?
Samuel's earstuds reflected light.
Mr. Clark, is your charisma irresistible to the boys now too?
Michael didn't speak. The young girl was stopped by a boy who seemed to hand her a letter in a pink envelope. The girl received it politely. The boy didn't leave and stood outside the school doctor's office, staring at Bessy's back. Samuel burst into laughter and said,
"Oh, so it was for Bessy. I finally met someone who could compete with you."
There was no expression on Michael's face. The corners of his mouth curled up casually, coldly. Bessy put down her things and went to the kitchen to take a look. She saw Mr. Clark staring at her and paused. "What's wrong?" Michael retracted his gaze, restless.
"The senior year is very important. I think it's important to study hard and not be distracted by other things."
Samuel gave him an inquisitive look. Bessy nodded solemnly. "Thank you. I think so too." Michael was surprised at her agreement. Bessy went in. There were still people hanging around outside, and Mr. Clark leaned casually on the sofa.
"Samuel, close the door."
In the Smith family home, Anne was sitting absent-mindedly at the dinner table. The joy on Grace Smith's face was undisguised as she whispered, "I heard that Mrs. Grant likes you very much." "Yeah." At the mention of this, Anne's mood improved and she cheered up. Grace's eyes brightened, and she was happier. She gave Anne a piece of meat.
"Get along well with Mrs. Grant, Jacob Grant."
The Grant family had power in Chicago, and it was difficult to make friends with them. After many years, this was the first time that Elise had treated her with a good attitude. Grace looked at Anne, her eyes softening. She lowered her voice, using a volume that only Anne could hear. "What's wrong?" Elise, who was sitting opposite, also saw that Anne wasn't in a good mood. "There's a parent-teacher meeting on Saturday." Anne turned back and smiled. She would never mention that Bessy had painted the board so well, but it really made her think of something. She seemed hesitant to speak. "It's for the entire 12th grade. Sister is also in the 12th grade. Mother, you should go to her parent-teacher meeting and let brother or father attend mine." Grace had been smiling at her previous sentence, but at the last sentence, her smile faded slightly. She thoughtfully said, "I'll take care of this, don't you worry." After hearing Grace's words, Anne's lips froze slightly. She lowered her head and ate. Seeing Grace's posture, it was apparent that she didn't intend to talk about this at the dinner table. After dinner, Anne closely watched Grace's movements and saw her go outside to call someone. After thinking about it, she followed her. Grace made 2 phone calls to Bessy, but she didn't pick up. She frowned and called a 3rd time. Bessy finally picked up. Her voice was somber and concise.
"What? You have a parent meeting on Saturday, right?"
Grace said, pressing her temple.
"I am going to Anne. Call your aunt and ask her to attend your parent-teacher meeting."
The parent-teacher meeting was linked to the students' performance and attitude. Grace had gone to several parent-teacher meetings for Anne. At that time, they had all been in the same class. Catherine Lewis had even named the parents whose children had bad grades. She said nothing serious and only criticized a little, but in the adult world, it was shameful. Thinking about Bessy's daily habits and grades, Grace would definitely not go for her parent-teacher meeting. She was also Anne's mother. Anne performed well in school and was very popular. When she walked with Anne, she would hear people discussing the fact that she was Anne's mother. Every time she had a parent meeting for Anne, she received the attention of other parents. Out of these 2 options, Grace would definitely choose Anne. Anne stood at the door, and when she heard the words, she pinched her fingers. To be honest, rather than Grace, she hoped that David or Thomas would attend instead. Unexpectedly, Grace didn't even consider Bessy. Anne was depressed. At this time, she even hoped that Bessy wasn't so lousy. Bessy hung up Grace's phone call impatiently. She thought about Anne's mother's words and laughed. Both of her aunt's children were in school and her uncle was also in the hospital. Aunt usually took off time to visit grandmother. Bessy hadn't even thought of asking her to come for her parent-teacher meeting. She walked to the classroom with her thermos cup filled with water. Her eyes were somber and her face cold, exuding a chill all around her. This didn't affect those looking at her or whispering about her. Within a few days of coming to the school, Susan West felt Bessy's popularity. Whether it was a post on the school or on other activities, the topic was Bessy. Instead, Anne wasn't much discussed. These days, people mainly talked about mysterious bulletin boards. After all, Bessy was a new student, and her looks even surpassed Anne's. Anne was also very good-looking, but they had seen her for 2 years and were aesthetically tired, especially when they could now look at Bessy's appearance and compare them. Susan was a freshman and was still in military training. After dinner in the evenings, she continued to train. The task of their class today was to clean the playground. A group of people walked on the road and unexpectedly saw Bessy. "Susan, look, your most popular cousin." Zoe Peterson held Susan's arm and whispered, her expression excited. As soon as Susan looked up, she saw Bessy. She immediately waved and yelled, "Cousin!" Just after finishing a phone call with Grace, Bessy wasn't in a good mood. Susan called her not far away. She looked up and her face slightly softened. She nodded slightly and looked over. "How are you adapting to class?" "The new classmates are all very good." Susan smiled as she spoke. She glanced at the cup in Bessy's hand. The cup lid was inlaid with a circle of diamond-like decorations, shiny, delicate, and beautiful. She couldn't help but glance at it one more time. Bessy nodded. Because she had stopped for a while, her presence became more apparent.
Bessy, wait for me.
Not far away, Paul ran over with a basketball. He walked towards Bessy and grabbed the hem of his shirt to wipe his sweat. Because he liked to play basketball, his abdominal muscles were obvious. He was handsome and was a well-known, rich second generation in the school. There were more people glancing over, and Susan even heard people say, "Bessy and Paul, together." Of course, Susan knew who Paul was. She couldn't help but stare at him. He was indeed an outstanding campus figure.
"Bring me a cup of Coke,"
Paul instructed his junior, and then tilted his head and asked Bessy,
"What do you want?"
Bessy shook her head.
"Okay."
Paul weighed his basketball and smiled at Susan.
"Do you know each other?"
"Yeah, she's my cousin." Bessy put her hand in her pocket and glanced at Susan. She said lazily, her expression slightly arrogant, "I'm leaving. Come and find me in English class if anything happens."
"Yes, cousin. Come to me too."
Paul followed Bessy while holding his basketball. He grinned at Susan before following Bessy quickly. He wasn't even annoyed that Bessy had kicked him aside. Unexpectedly, Paul and Bessy were close. He seemed much closer to her than to Anne.
"Susan, are you related to the most popular girl in the school?"
The boys in Susan's class looked at her in surprise. The girls in the class also looked at Susan with envy, and she was quickly surrounded by people. Susan remembered the logo on Bessy's cup. When she was picking up trash on the playground, she took out her mobile phone and searched the internet. The cup that looked very beautiful turned out to be a luxury brand. She didn't find one that Bessy had, but she saw that this brand's cups were at least $2,000. It was almost Andrea's 1-month salary. Didn't she hear that the Smith family didn't like her cousin? Then why did they buy such an expensive cup for her? In the quiet alley by the school, Jacob Grant looked at the girl who was opposite him, pressing her eyebrows.
"Why did you move out of the Grant family home?"
Scarlett Rogers bowed her head and whispered, "I want to study hard for senior year."
"Study hard?"
Jacob raised his eyebrows.
"Don't just say it to please me, okay?"
Scarlett looked up, glanced at him, and turned to leave. She was pulled back by her wrists, and he wrapped his hands around her waist. The man leaned on her shoulder and conceded,
"We haven't seen each other for several months, yet you're still so cold to me."
"Senior year." Scarlett opened her mouth. Jacob interrupted her.
"You want to study hard, right? Your results are already good enough for Howard University."
Scarlett sighed. "Jacob, I'm really not a genius." Not far away was the sound of student voices talking. Scarlett was the top student and was quite famous. Jacob let go of her reluctantly.
"What relationship do you have with my father?"
Jacob stared at her and pinched her cheeks.
"Don't tell me you're really my dad's illegitimate daughter."
Scarlett had never mentioned her parents. Jacob had investigated it before to no avail. It was as if someone had covered it up deliberately. Scarlett wanted to explain the parent-teacher meeting. At the mention of this, she swallowed her words and lowered her head, her eyes dim. Episode 30. This is Bessy's brother? The parents' meeting was on Saturday. The students also had to be present for the meeting, but they were either standing in the corridor or at the back of the classroom. The parents sat on the corresponding student seats in the classroom. Grace Smith wore a new seasonal outfit today and took Anne out of the car by the arm. The black BMW wasn't very noticeable behind a Cayenne. High school seniors and their parents were everywhere on campus. Grace maintained her calm expression. She had come to such meetings for Anne before, once a year, and every time she brought Anne here, she received lots of attention. She walked into the school gate with Anne. As soon as she smiled, she heard a voice not far behind her say,
"Oh, Bessy's parents didn't come. Mom, I wanted to bring you to see my future father-in-law or mother-in-law."
"Dad, Bessy is the most popular girl I told you about. Later on, you can look at the English class's board. She found someone to do it." Then, the crowd surged and another student pushed Grace aside, holding her mobile phone in her hand, shouting excitedly, "Is it really Bessy's brother? Her brother looks like that?" There were many high school seniors and their guardians. They rushed over enthusiastically at the same time. Their voices, Grace thought, weren't what she had imagined. In Brightbow High School, the students either had good grades or had good families, and all had excellent conditions. It wasn't easy to be outstanding among these people. For a long time, Grace had been the mother of the child other parents compared their kids to. In the past, when she came to Brightbow High School, she and Anne were the targets of other people's attention. But now, the name Bessy was chanted from all of their mouths. Grace was a bit uncomfortable. "Mrs. Adams." She saw a familiar figure in front and unconsciously called out, "Mrs. Smith." Mrs. Adams was wearing a long blue dress. She looked gentle and spoke softly and swiftly, not like the handsome and dauntless-looking young man beside her. Paul squinted and glanced at her, but his eyes didn't stop wavering.
"Mom, hurry."
Mrs. Adams said sorry to Grace and walked to the side of Paul. Grace could hear her whisper to Paul,
"What are you anxious about? Bessy and her brother can't possibly run away, right?"
Paul's family business was based in Evanston and abroad. Although Doug Adams had created a startup, he was indeed a business genius. In Chicago, legend had it that Mrs. Adams was Evanston's most prestigious lady. Grace didn't know much about these high society things, but she knew that everyone in Chicago was afraid of the Adams family. In the past, because of Anne, Grace could barely say a few words to Mrs. Adams, so they weren't very close. Paul was mischievous and was difficult to approach as well. But now, Grace listened to the two of them talking about Bessy as if they were old friends.
"Anne."
Grace had rarely been scorned so much in Anne's school and was more surprised than offended. She hesitated and asked Anne,
"Is there another person called Bessy in your school?"
Anne lowered her head slightly and didn't immediately answer. She also felt depressed. Recently, Bessy has been too popular. She was cold and proud, and not only did the boys all like her, but the girls were also her fans. "It's almost time, Mom. Let's go to the first class." Anne avoided Grace's question. I see him. Bessy's brother is so handsome." "Oh my God, they're really a goddess and a god. I love it." The surrounding voices babbled on, and Grace was visibly upset. She didn't even notice that Anne had not answered her. Bessy had no knowledge or skills and couldn't do anything to excel in this group of heavenly pride. The prestigious families in Chicago had many senior students here, and Grace recognized a few of the ladies. This was why Grace hadn't wanted to go to Bessy's meeting. At first, the teacher had been unwilling to accept Bessy, so Grace was in a complicated mood. It was probably someone with the same name. She didn't believe that Bessy would be so popular with the students. The parent-teacher meeting was for nothing more than emphasizing the importance of study to the high school seniors.
"Mom, my seat is there."
Paul stood at the window, pointing to his seat in the classroom, surrounded by many girls.
"That's Bessy's brother."
Paul pointed to Bessy's seat but didn't see Bessy. He glanced around, trying to locate her. Mrs. Adams smiled calmly as she walked towards Paul's seat, while looking at the girl's seat. The girl had surfaced frequently in Paul's house recently. Paul was always talking about her. She saw a lazy, beautiful man sitting in the seat. Mrs. Adams' footsteps shook and her complexion changed at a speed that was visible to the naked eye, and she could barely stabilize her footsteps. There were many people looking at him, but Michael Clark could still feel Mrs. Adams' gaze. He glanced at her slightly, and though he saw her, she wasn't someone he knew. Michael retracted his gaze, leaned back, and spun a pen around in his hand. Under the light obliquely shining through the window, his long legs awkwardly rested under the table. The middle-aged woman at the front table pulled the chair too quickly and accidentally hit the table. There were so many things on Bessy's table that it couldn't withstand the force. Boom! Michael lowered his head. The floor was full of letters. There were pink letters, baby blue letters, white letters, and red hearts. There were dozens.
Mary's deskmate is so popular.
This was Mary's father. He saw that Michael was young and touched his head, asking,
You're Mary's deskmate's brother or uncle?
Michael picked up the things from the ground expressionlessly. He raised his head and looked upset, but was polite.
I'm neither.
Then, Michael repeated patiently and calmly,
I am not her relative.
His tone was very approachable, but Mr. Clark had a strong aura, and it was obvious, at first glance, that he wasn't an ordinary person. The people in the room were even afraid to meet eyes with him. The parents in the class were discussing Mr. Clark with each other. The parents sitting beside him were very quiet. Michael was slow and thoughtful as he tidied the letters. Very good. There were 32 letters. It looked like she had only collected them from last night. He confiscated them all. Mr. Clark was very cold. Stephen Scott didn't criticize the students and mostly gave them encouragement. He wrote an observation manual for each student and distributed it to the parents one by one. The development on his side was slow, but the parents' meeting of the first class was very fast. Catherine Lewis gave a few typical compliments and then picked a few typical lagging students to criticize. The parents' meeting ended early. Anne's studies were good, and she was also busy with the school's anniversary. Mrs. Lewis praised those key points. These years, people gathered together either for their husbands or their children. Grace was obviously very used to it, and her hesitation disappeared. I heard that Anne is going to study in Evanston with a famous teacher. Mrs. Smith, you're blessed, a familiar little sister praised. Grace laughed. Anne had always been her pride, so of course she was happy to hear someone boasting about Anne. She was about to say something when she saw a commotion in the corridor.
What are they looking at?
Grace glanced over. The other mothers around them also gathered together and laughed.
Look, it's Bessy. I heard from my daughter that she just transferred over this semester and even has the same surname as your daughter. But this child is really so beautiful. No wonder she's so popular, eh? Isn't that the Addams family beside her?
Grace turned away from the crowd and looked downstairs. The girl's face was cold and she was indifferently arrogant. The boy beside her was holding a few bottles of water for her. It was a well-known face. Grace snorted inwardly, her head blank. Paul had to ask several students before realizing that Bessy had come with her brother. Then he went to the store. He saw that Stephen Scott wasn't going to end anytime soon and went to find Bessy.
Your brother.
Paul had thought that Bessy's brother was Thomas Smith, but he saw that it wasn't. He had never heard Bessy say that she had an older brother. Hold your water properly. Bessy glanced at the second floor and saw Grace in the crowd at one glance. She casually retracted her eyes, raised her eyebrows, her tone indifferent. Paul scratched his head and remembered that Grace had come with Anne in the morning. He thought of how they both had the same mother and lowered his head in silence. He followed her step by step. That's Paul Addams, right? Grace's friend whispered. Paul looked spoiled, but after all, he was the Addams family's heir. Other than towards Kenneth White, it was rare to see him in such a good temper. Grace naturally saw him as well. The boy downstairs followed behind Bessy casually, holding water in his hand, and often tilted his head to talk to the girl. The girl was lazy and didn't like to speak, but the young master didn't mind. He was still smiling.
I'm going to the bathroom.
Grace's mood was a little complicated and she spoke absently. She didn't hold a parent-teacher meeting for Bessy because she was afraid of being shamed. She was afraid that people would look at her with strange eyes and criticize her. Look, that's Bessy's mother. But now, Grace turned on the tap and patted water on her face. The parent meeting of the English class was almost over. Stephen met Michael alone to speak in the office. He handed Michael a small observation diary and said,
It's not that Bessy isn't smart. If she works hard, it's not impossible for her to go to college. She needs the cooperation of her parents to guide her. If you have time, you can show more concern about her life. There's no such thing as letting a child be.
Facing Michael, Stephen felt some inexplicable pressure that he didn't feel in front of Paul's parents. He was obviously very tepid, but was also very elegant. Michael flipped through this small observation diary. It didn't have many pages, but it was very meticulous. Stephen had even written down the books Bessy read.
Thank you, teacher.
Michael closed the observation diary. Normally, Mr. Clark wouldn't even listen to others, but today he listened very carefully to the teachings.
I will guide her well.
After speaking, he went out to where Bessy and Paul were. He turned and followed Mrs. Addams.
You are Bessy's
Episode 31. First Vest. Paul thought Michael was Bessy's cousin or something, and he even sighed in his heart that their genes were indeed very good. Michael said nothing. He just shoved the manual into his pocket and looked at Paul calmly. He was a handsome man, but Paul's throat was inexplicably tight.
I'm not her brother.
Michael looked down. His eyes were dark and seemed to contain nothing but Bessy. His voice was smooth and husky.
Then,
Paul's mother kicked him before he could say another word. Anxious and fierce, Paul swallowed back his words. Bessy was also going to see her grandmother. When the four of them arrived at the school gate, they parted ways. After Bessy had left with Michael, Paul rubbed his legs.
Mom, why did you hit me?
Don't be such a busybody. Mrs. Adams looked at the departing Volkswagen and then the Evanston sign on the back. She was finally certain.
Next time to Bessy.
Forget it. She wanted to say something, but still held back. She glanced in the direction of which the car had just left.
Let's go back.
The black car with the Evanston license plate stopped at the hospital door.
When you come down, just give me a call in advance. I'll be in the building opposite, the inpatient department.
Michael put his hand on the steering wheel. He looked sideways and opened the door for Bessy. The space in the car wasn't small, and Bessy was deep in her own thoughts. When she came to her senses, Michael had already opened the door. His face was close to hers. She could clearly see his features, and his mint-cold fragrance surrounded her. It only lasted a few seconds before the door opened. Bessy got out of the car. Michael stared at her back. He smiled slightly. Michael didn't get out of the car. In fact, he didn't have anything to do today. He slowly took out the observation diary that Stephen had just given him and looked at the suggestions written in it. After a long while, he lowered half of the car window, took out a cigarette, and smoked. His eyes became clearer. Bessy didn't tell her grandmother about the parents' meeting. She came late today, so she made an excuse, and her grandmother never doubted her. Andrea and Pete were both there. Susan and Pete just finished their military training the day before. Both of them were tanned. Pete was still fine, but Susan had gone one shade too dark. Visiting Grandma together on Saturday morning had become a convention. After a while, Grace arrived. She seemed to be thinking of something complicated.
Did Anne not come today?
Bertha Wilson was not in a good state of mind. Her hair was gray and she was sick. Grace took a look at Bessy, put away her complex thoughts, and smiled.
Anne went back to practice the violin. Her aunt found a famous teacher in Evanston, a world-class palace master. Anne has been working hard recently for him to accept her as his apprentice.
Speaking of Anne, Grace had a strong smile on her face. Anne's presence was indeed her pride. Second cousins are amazing. Susan West was surprised. She didn't know much about this, but hearing about the master surprised her.
Yes, her teacher has been touring around the world recently. When he comes back to Evanston, Anne will go see him.
Susan West brought Grace a chair, and Grace sat down. She talked as if Rupert Grint was Anne's teacher.
That's good.
Bertha couldn't help but look at Bessy, who was cutting her apple slowly and seriously. The sharp fruit knife became a toy to her. Bertha sighed and turned her head.
Which teacher is Anne going to worship?
Teacher Rupert Grint.
Grace held up a glass of water and took a sip.
You must never have heard of him.
Rupert was a professional palace-level master. His reputation had spread to the upper classes, and Grace had only heard of him recently. Just after she finished speaking, she saw Bertha freeze.
Mom, what's wrong with you?
Grace felt that Bertha's reaction was strange. Bertha looked up and hesitantly said,
This teacher, Rupert Grint, sounds familiar.
Bessy had peeled the apple skin and cut it into small pieces. She squeezed a piece into Bertha's mouth and said blankly, Grandma, eat the apples. Bertha's words were trapped back into her throat. Grace put the teacup down and didn't pay much attention.
Oh, I think it's probably one of your friends that has the same name. It's a typical name.
Maybe,
Bertha said vaguely. Her teeth weren't as good now, so she chewed very slowly. Bessy finished cutting the apple. She put it on a plate and inserted a few toothpicks into the slices. Bertha kept looking at Bessy silently. Bessy sighed silently, lowered her head and said warmly, "I'll go back to school first." She still had to do her part-time job at the coffee shop.
Go and study hard. Grandma is waiting for you to enter university.
Bessy lowered her head slightly and seemed to be smiling, but she said solemnly, "Yeah, I will." She turned around and went out. Grace remembered the parents' meeting this morning and went out as well. On the hospital bed, Bertha looked at Bessy's back, her eyes murky. She had indeed heard the name Rupert Grint before. Wasn't the teacher who had come from the capital to Fairfield and stayed there for a whole month, wanting to accept Bessy as his apprentice, also called Rupert Grint? Outside the door, Grace overtook Bessy in 2 or 3 steps. This was a VIP ward and there weren't many people in the corridor. Grace lowered her voice.
Why didn't you let your aunt go to your parents' meeting today?
My aunt is busy. Without her grandma's presence, Bessy looked impatient. She glanced at Grace, still looking sloppy. She raised her hand and pressed the elevator button. Anything else?
Then,
Grace's mind was still full of what had happened at school. She asked,
"How are you getting along with your classmates in school? Are you used to studying? Have you made any friends?"
After so many days of school, this was the first time Bessy had heard Grace ask about her learning. "It's okay," she said patiently and succinctly. "I'll go first." Grace also wanted to ask if she was familiar with Paul, but Bessy didn't want to talk to her anymore. Grace could only watch as the elevator door closed slowly in front of her. Her expression was complex. Bessy went downstairs. She had a bus card and didn't plan to call Michael. Bus 12 went directly to Brightbow High School, which was particularly convenient. When she got out of the hospital gate, she hadn't even reached the bus stop opposite when a black car stopped in front of her. The window was lowered. Michael tapped the steering wheel and said slowly, "Get in." The car drove directly to the school medical office. Bessy noticed that the school doctor's room door was open. She paused. Didn't he say that Samuel had matters to attend to today? She was just thinking about it. She saw a man in black coming out of the school medical office. He was wearing short sleeves, and the cyan tattoo on his arm was faint. He was surrounded by a fierce aura and didn't look good to provoke.
"Mr. Clark,"
the man in black said when Michael got out of the car, respectfully and cautiously.
"The investigation."
Before he finished, he saw another person getting out of the car with Mr. Clark. It wasn't too surprising that another person was in the car with Mr. Clark, but the fact that it was a woman, the man in black was stunned.
"Let's eat first."
It was hot outside, and Michael reached up and unbuttoned a button at his neckline. He thought of something and said in a low voice,
"Did you bring the things?"
"I did." The man in black regained his senses, but he couldn't help glancing over at Bessy. When the three entered the house, Bessy saw a stack of books on the table in the school medical office. It wasn't an exaggeration to describe it as a stack.
"Drink water."
Michael took a cup and poured a glass of warm water for Bessy. He went over to the stack of books on the table. After picking and choosing, he drew 5 books and handed them out to Bessy. Bessy glanced casually at the first book. College Entrance Examination Review Step 1.
"Mr. Scott asked me to make sure you're studying."
Michael turned and poured himself a glass of water. His voice was lazy.
"I picked it out for you. It's perfect for you."
Michael came over holding the water. While she had been visiting her grandmother in the hospital, he had come up with a review plan for her. He walked over, pointed at a book with his finger, and lowered himself to Bessy's height. He bent his head, wanting to introduce these review materials to Bessy. Bessy picked up a book, blinked, tilted her head and slowly said, "I don't need it." The eyes of the two inevitably met. A strand of hair was slanted across his eyes, mouth, nose, and forehead. This distance made even his slight breathing sound obvious. Bessy was usually indifferent, cold, and unconcerned. Michael couldn't stand it. He stood up straight, took a step back, and said seriously,
Mr. Scott said you're very smart. As long as you're willing to study, it'll be easy for you to get into college.
Bessy tilted her head and focused her attention on the book, only to find that she had never seen the information in the book. She took all 5 books. One book had a hyperbola drawn on it and seemed to have a bunch of messy numbers. The next book was a review for physics. Bessy paused and then said, "Thank you." Today's meal was delivered by the hotel, and the man in black tried hard to make himself invisible. He refrained from looking at Bessy. Bessy returned to her bedroom after eating. This weekend, there was no one in the bedroom. Abigail had gone to self-study, and Mary had gone home with her father. Bessy put the books on the table. Then she took out the computer and turned it on. The computer turned on quickly. She reached and quickly pressed a few keys, and a voice popped up. A voice from the man at the other end said,
"Are you finally contacting me?
Talk." Bessy went to the bathroom and took a towel to wipe her face. She turned on the voice changer, and her voice was blurred.
"Everyone else is anxiously asking me if you're starting to accept orders."
The man paused, grumbled, and complained.
"Master, you said that you were in a bad state and you wanted to take a break. But you know how long you've gone without any orders? 1 year and 4 months.
Bessy sat on the chair, flipped through the book with her other hand, and laughed.
"Jared, I remember taking a 10 million order just a few days ago."
If anyone who knew about this matter were present, their expression would definitely change instantly. Jared Covington, the founder of 129 Detective Office, didn't know whether this detective office was linked to the dark web, but everyone knew that even if it was cross-border, as long as there was money involved, there was no information that 129 couldn't find, and no case they couldn't solve.
"So, are you in a good state now?"
Jared asked seriously. Episode 32, Lone Wolf. "Ah," Bessy said casually. She looked at the title of the information book with great care. "Last time the order was an accident, but my mental state is better."
"Really?"
Jared had only asked casually as a joke, but after hearing Bessy's answer, he was stunned. Instead, he shot up from the sofa. "Let's start next month." Bessy put the book aside, picked up another one, and spoke slowly. "I'm not in a rush."
"Oh my God, even if you start next month, I won't have any problem."
Jared paced a few steps around his room, unable to hide his excitement. He finally couldn't help but burst into laughter.
"As long as you're willing to come back. Do you know how scared I was that you'd stop taking orders after disappearing for 1 whole year?"
As long as Bessy didn't quit, Jared was at ease. Bessy wasn't surprised by Jared's attitude. There were many members in the 129 Detective Agency. Even if an external psychological criminal detective was only an ordinary member, once placed in the outside world and producing information, they were more useful and gained more work experience than being on an inspection team for 1 year. It was too difficult to join 129. Bessy was a lone senior wolf in 129. As long as she took the order, there was nothing she couldn't do. She was also a veteran of 129. Because the headquarters were in Evanston, Bessy had never met the members of 129. Jared knew her name was Bessy, but didn't know her age. Bessy had joined 4 years ago. At the time, her voice had been slightly immature, so for the convenience of work, she used a voice changer. She had used it until now. "Then you've worried too much. I'm short on money." Bessy leaned against the back of the chair casually.
"It's good to be short of money."
If she was short of money, she wouldn't resign. Jared grinned. If the people in the Evanston office saw that the steel-faced and selfless director had such a side to him, their jaws would probably drop.
"You said you would come to Evanston this year. When are you coming?"
Before other forces could find the lone wolf, Jared wanted to tie her to 129. Something went wrong. Bessy looked down at the book and her focus drifted off. "I can go next year." Jared paused.
"What's up?"
Bessy was very casual. "The college entrance examination?" Jared froze for a moment, then said again,
"If you don't want to say it, I'll just spread the news of your return first."
Bessy hung up. She swore that, from the beginning to end, she had never lied. The heavy black cell phone, which she had put aside, lit up again. "I really didn't find it. I'll take you to the scan next time." Bessy slammed the phone onto the table. The phone buzzed and vibrated a few times again. Seeing that Bessy really didn't care about it, it wasn't very happy and quietened again. "Scarlett, why didn't your guardian come again?" Mrs. Lewis looked at the student in front of her, frowning. "Forget it. Give me your guardian's phone number." Scarlett pursed her lips. She lowered her head so that her face couldn't be seen. "Teacher, my uncle is busy and has no time. However, the college entrance examination is very important. Don't delay your college entrance examination because of these things." Mrs. Lewis was Scarlett's last class teacher. She naturally knew that her parents had died and that she was staying with her relatives now. "Last time, your results fluctuated. The dorm is too noisy and has affected your studies. I hope to talk to your guardian and let you continue to study well. Teacher, I promise I can do better next exam," Scarlett said simply. In the end, Mrs. Lewis didn't say anything and just frowned unhappily. She couldn't find the phone number for Scarlett's guardian on file, nor did she know what was going on at the school. How could such obviously flawed files be included? Scarlett was stopped at the school by a middle-aged man before returning to the class.
"Mrs. Grant is looking for you."
She followed him in silence. Not far from the school gate, a Porsche was parked. She sat in the front seat and the graceful woman in the back seat finally raised her head.
"Scarlett, who are you showing off to?"
Scarlett froze. "Aunt?" Mrs. Grant sneered and said,
"Uncle Grant isn't here, so you don't have to be so fake and call me that. You had a parent meeting today, right? Scarlett, I know about you. Don't think you can influence anyone by doing this. I'll tell Gerald the truth today."
Scarlett got out of the car and watched the Porsche drive farther and farther away. The sun was shining above her head, but she felt cold all over. Samuel Bright strolled around and finally went back to the school at 12 o'clock. There weren't many people in the school. When he walked to the school hospital with his mobile phone, he saw a somewhat familiar figure squatting on the edge of the path. The person had her head buried between her knees. He looked for a long while, but the other party didn't look up. He knew who it was by her short hair.
"Classmate, aren't you Bessy's friend? What's wrong?"
Samuel's hand froze and he stuck a hand in his pocket. He crouched down in front of her. Scarlett looked up, her face pale and her eyes red. Samuel looked at her, thought about it, and went to the coffee shop next door to buy a cup of hot milk tea. He handed it to her.
"Bessy's favorite."
Scarlett glanced at Samuel for a long while, not knowing what to think. She took it and suddenly laughed. It was only for a moment, and she was sullen again. She whispered, "Thank you," and walked around him. She was timid. Samuel looked at her. She was clearly wearing a pair of trousers, but she showed her fair ankles because of their shortness. She and Bessy were really friends. They were both so poor. Samuel had never had any interest. With a wave of his hand in Evanston, women would stick to him like sticky notes. He looked at Scarlett sideways as she left, not even turning back. After half a moment, he raised his head and chuckled. Paul lay on the table and looked in Bessy's direction. She wasn't reading those extracurricular books today, but instead had review materials in front of her. He had never seen that before. Bessy wore headphones and sat sideways on a stool, propping her legs up casually. At this direction, most of her profile could be seen, and she was looking at a question in the book, frowning and seeming very annoyed.
"Kenneth, you didn't come yesterday, so you don't know."
He had heard that Bessy had just started studying and reading today and was in a bad mood, so Paul didn't dare to provoke her at this time. He poked Kenneth's shoulder.
"Bessy's brother was here."
He paused.
"I don't know what relationship they have, but anyway, their family genes are really good."
Kenneth's family never came for the parent-teacher meeting, yet he had always been first in school, so the school had no opinion about it. Kenneth heard the name Bessy and moved his eyebrows, but didn't raise them.
"Kenny, go and get the physics paper."
Due to Paul, most people called Kenneth Kenny. Kenneth put down his pen and went to the office to get the paper. Anne was already there. She was slow, and when she saw Kenneth coming, she paused and came out with him casually. "This time, the paper is really difficult. I heard that the passing rate is only 50%.
Did you complete the last question?
Kenneth picked up the paper. Physics had always been his poorest subject. He had answered all the other questions, but couldn't solve the last question. No. Anne shook her head and spoke again. "I scanned through the papers, and Scarlett didn't solve it either." Kenneth nodded. He quickened his pace to head to self-study. Anne's hands were tight behind her. When Kenneth was handing out the papers, he froze at Mary's paper and said,
"Mary, how did you do this question?"
He pointed to Mary's last physics fill-in-the-blank question, his gaze sharp. Mary was working on a math paper. When she heard him asking her, she was stunned. Then she patted Bessy. "Yeah, Bessy, how did you do it?" Listening to Mary's words, Kenneth looked at Bessy, who was holding her head irritably and spinning a pen around. He was such a calm and composed person, yet even he couldn't react in time. "I couldn't answer this question, but when I was submitting it, Bessy helped me fill it in." Mary seemed to see that Kenneth was surprised and tilted her head to explain. Physics wasn't the same as English, especially when filling in the blanks. This question was impossible to even start solving, and time was tight. So Mary had just given it a glance and skipped it. When she handed in the paper later, Mary didn't even do many of the big questions, so how could she worry about filling in the blank questions? Mary felt that Bessy had obsessive-compulsive disorder. She filled the paper up every time and didn't leave any blanks and couldn't even bear to see Mary leaving a question empty. She had taken her pen to fill it in for her. Knowing Bessy's rate of correct answers, Mary had just let her write it. Unexpectedly, this time she got it right. Mary shook Bessy's arm again. "Bessy! Bessy!" "Are you a pig?" Bessy pressed her temple, placed her pen on the book, and leaned back against the chair. She propped her legs and scanned over the question. If they couldn't even do this question, how could they go to Howard University? Bessy glanced at Mary. It was the highest academic institution in the country. Howard University ranked among the top universities in the world. Most of the people in Brightbow High School were expected to enter Howard University. This question? Bessy raised her chin and cleared her throat. I did it randomly. Did it randomly? 5.5 times 11? Who was bored enough to write down such a complicated answer randomly? The average person would guess 2 or the root of 2. Mary and Kenneth obviously didn't believe it. That's it. Bessy sat casually and knocked on the table with one hand, motioning for Mary to take the paper off the table. Mary took it back, not understanding, but didn't forget to observe Bessy's expression. Bessy's face was still casual as she narrowed her eyes. I tried to solve this question for half the day and got this equation. Since it was wrong, I just copied it onto your answer sheet. Mary and Kenneth looked down. Bessy's first big question was indeed filled in with the equation. The first major problem in mathematics was basically divided into sub-questions. The correct answer was 36, except for those who made careless mistakes. Probably only Bessy in the whole school could give such a messy answer. Since she worked so hard to figure it out the first time, it made sense that she would keep it in her mind. Without Bessy explaining it, Mary provided the reason for Bessy's brain. Oh, that's why. Mary nodded. Kenneth heard the words and furrowed his eyebrows, but he didn't say anything more. He put down Bessy's paper and glanced over at the workbook that Bessy was doing. The book had a blue cover. It looked familiar. Kenneth stepped forward. One more glance at that material and he saw that it was indeed the exercise booklet of the high school attached to Howard University. This exercise book was produced by the high school itself. It wasn't difficult, but it required very comprehensive and logical thinking. Kenneth had done it himself. The exercise book was only sold in the Evanston area. Other states and cities had no idea that such review material existed. He had yet to see anyone use this exercise book in Chicago. Kenneth couldn't help but take another look. Bessy put on the headset again and began to draw on the exercise book with a pen. She was still left-handed and wrote slowly, but didn't stay on the paper for long. Occasionally, she drew on a piece of draft paper. Even though she was slow, she didn't waver, and her writing was smooth. Within a minute, a blank question was written. Kenneth glanced to the side. Bessy tore off the answer and pressed it under her arm. He looked away indifferently. He had been willing to remind her last time, but this time he didn't even want to mention it. He distributed Bessy's paper and left directly. After writing a few pages of questions, Bessy turned the music's volume up and lay down on the table to sleep. Episode 33. Is that Principal White's car? Before going to sleep, she reached out and drew a few questions on Mary's paper. I don't understand this, and that. Listen carefully and tell me after class. When Mrs. Lewis came to class to explain the exercises, she saw Bessy sleeping again and frowned. She really didn't know what the principal and Mr. Scott were thinking. Placing such a person in the class simply affected the learning atmosphere. Bessy sighed. What kind of fairy deskmate was she to worry about her deskmate's studies? Principal's office. Principal White was holding a book in his hand. He wasn't reading it and held his glasses in his hand. He was surprised to see the person sitting in front of him.
Michael, what's the matter? Do you have files on Bessy?
Michael asked, holding a cup of tea. His eyes were deep and his long fingertips reflected against the porcelain teacup.
Yes?
Principal White froze and didn't quite know how to react.
Change her emergency contact phone number to Samuel's temporarily.
Michael paused and said again.
It seems that her family doesn't care about her. She's a high school student working in our school medical office.
The Bright family did charity for everyone in Evanston. Principal White hadn't expected that Samuel had such kindness in him. Michael reported a string of numbers. Principal White noted it down. After Michael left, he looked towards Michael's figure thoughtfully. It stood to reason that, as the principal, he shouldn't do so. The emergency contact was originally Grace's number, which had never been changed ever since the primary school file, but Principal White looked in the direction where Michael had left. In the end, he still changed the number. It was only when looking at this number did he realize that Samuel's number seemed to end with the number 8. Was this number the wrong one? Principal White, someone is looking for you outside.
Who?
Principal White returned to his senses. It's the Smith family. When Bessy went to the school medical office, Samuel was prescribing medicine to a student. Michael wasn't in the school medical office. She went straight into the kitchen. After a while, the big man in black who she had seen before pushed open the door of the school's medical room and came in. His face was stiff and his body was full of anger.
Where is Michael?
He asked with a sigh of breath. He noticed someone in the kitchen and hesitated. It was the girl he had seen at noon the day before yesterday. The man in black lowered his voice self-consciously.
He went to find Principal White.
Samuel handed the medicine to the student, and when the student left the school's medical office, he turned his head.
What's the matter? The soup team has found news.
When he said this, the man in black paused. He looked at the kitchen and had some reservations.
There's no need to check anymore.
Samuel didn't avoid Bessy. He threw his pen on the table. The man in black didn't contain his surprise.
Why? We found LW.
Michael pushed open the door and came in. The wind blew against him and his voice was low and lazy. The man in black was anxious and wanted to argue, but after hearing this sentence, his brain lagged and he didn't react. He just froze there. In the kitchen, Bessy's hands slipped and a glass cup fell by her feet. Crash! Michael looked over there.
Are you okay?
Bessy squatted down and picked up the cup, emotionless. I'm okay. Michael came in to help her clean up the glass fragments on the ground. Bessy waited for him to walk back out to talk to Samuel and the other man before stopping. She stood there with her eyes lowered, thinking of something, a little stunned. She had set the black cell phone aside. After Michael went out, it lit up. 2 minutes later, it brightened impassively. Bessy came back to her senses and saw that it was desperately lighting up. She turned her head away expressionlessly and stopped looking at it.
Marvin Clark.
Outside the door, Samuel put his legs on the table and his chair rotated 180 degrees backward. He spun a pen in his hand.
I sent an email last time to Robert Soup, but I can't reveal the specific details.
Marvin was still stunned. After a long time, he found his voice, cleared his throat, and said,
Michael, how did you do it?
LW, Lone Wolf, was number 1 in Detective Agency 129. Because it operated internationally, people from the outside world had provided this nickname. Although Marvin Clark was also the leader of the SWAT team that year, he had failed the exam 3 times and wasn't even an ordinary member. From criminal investigation to criminology, there wasn't anyone who had never heard of that genius in 129. Marvin looked in the direction of the kitchen again, deliberately lowered his voice and said shakily,
I heard he hasn't taken any orders for more than a year. How did you make him?
As he talked, Bessy came out with a few bowls. Marvin immediately shut up and stopped the conversation. Thinking about it, Marvin felt stupid again. There was no need to be so careful. The girl was wearing a school jacket and was a student. Even if she heard, how would she know what he was saying? While eating, Michael first introduced the man in black to Bessy.
This is Marvin Clark. When I'm not around next time, you can find him.
Bessy glanced at Marvin and nodded. Then, he started to ask about the few exercises he had given her.
Have you started doing them?
Yeah. Bessy was sullen.
Okay.
Samuel smiled easily and said,
Bessy, don't tell me you saved all the trouble and just copied the answers. Do you know what Michael did for that set?
Samuel didn't finish speaking before Michael put his hand on the table and glared at him. Samuel immediately waved his hand and put a finger to his mouth, indicating that he would shut up. He looked at Michael and sighed. Half a month ago, just when Michael was called here to do hard work, Samuel never would have thought that he would encounter such a thing. Michael actually made such a big fuss over study review materials. Maybe those people in Evanston thought that they were in such a hurry for some important files. Marvin didn't dare to talk from start to finish, and he didn't have his dinner with the two of them. After eating, Marvin watched Bessy and Michael go out together. His frown was slightly hesitant.
Samuel, that girl.
Don't mess with her. Samuel leaned on the back of the chair. He wanted to wash the dishes, but since Marvin was here, he let him wash them. He smiled again.
Our Michael cares about her a lot.
Marvin stared at him thinking,
what was it with this girl?
There were a lot of women chasing Michael in Evanston, and even his own goddess was chasing Michael. How could none of them compare to a senior year student? It looked like her results weren't even particularly good. Oh, but she sure was beautiful. No one in Evanston could look better than her. Military training for high school had ended, and there were no freshmen wearing camouflage clothes to grab a meal in the cafeteria these days. Bessy was sitting on a chair, still fighting with the exercise book. She had on her black headphones and the volume was very high, but for some reason, the classroom was still really noisy. Bessy felt like her brain was being squeezed and was buzzing. Her eyes were slightly red. Her bangs slipped over her forehead and she threw her pen with a slam. She supported her chin in one hand and tapped her fingers on the table. After so many days, Mary knew almost all of Bessy's personality quirks and habits. She leaned over and whispered, I heard that the school bully, that Brian Jake, just transferred to our school. Mary hadn't finished when she remembered Bessy knew Brian well. He's here as a sports student. Brian wasn't from Brightbow High School, but his fame here wasn't lower than that of Kenneth White. To a certain extent, it was even higher. He used to be at Baybridge High School, and although the students of Brightbow High School were afraid of him, it wasn't too big of a deal. But now, the school bully was transferring over to Brightbow High School. In their eyes, it was tantamount to putting a wolf in the middle of a group of sheep. Oh, Bessy nodded, picked up the pen and started the question, and turned up the volume of her headset a bit. Fortunately, the class bell rang and the discussions disappeared. After school at night, Bessy waited for the other students to leave before packing up. Bessy, let's go out and buy some materials first. Mary closed her book and waited for Bessy. Mrs. Lewis had arranged a new review information book and had asked them to purchase it at the bookstore next to the school to use in class later. At the same time, outside the school gate, there weren't many people on the road, but because school had just been dismissed, there were actually quite a few people walking together. Aunt, are you here to visit Principal White? Anne said hello to Kenneth and went toward them holding a book. A few people who had yet to notice Kenneth paused when they heard the words, Principal White. Kenneth had always been proud and had never taken the initiative to greet someone. Elise didn't pay attention to Kenneth White and shook her head slightly. I saw his assistant. How many people in Evanston wanted to meet Principal White? In Evanston, she might even have to take a queue number. Anne wasn't surprised. She lowered her head again. The group was very eye-catching, especially Elise, who had her own nobility. She was about to get in the car. Aunt, second cousin, why are you here? After cleaning up and coming out late, Susan saw them and quickly loosened Zoe's hand and trotted over. Susan wasn't wearing a school jacket today, but a new skirt Andrea had bought for her in the mall. It was a little too long. Andrea had to raise a family, and there was even a family member in a vegetative state. How could she have so much money on her hands? She just bought new clothes for Susan, but the pattern and colors were all discounted goods from last year. It was cheap, but unfashionable. Elise had been in Evanston for a long time, and she was used to judging people. Susan was a little uncomfortable. She pinched her skirt and saw the figure walking not far away. She beckoned for her quickly. Cousin, Aunt is here. Bessy was too lazy to care about them. She rolled her eyes and turned up the volume on her earphones. A jeep stopped slowly beside her, honking its horn and lowering the window. Elise noticed that it was an Evanston license plate. She suddenly said in shock, Isn't that Principal White's car? Episode 34. Looking for Death. There was quite a distance between Evanston and Chicago, and Evanston license plates were mostly rare around here. They knew that in the whole school only Principal White was from Evanston. That is why Elise had exclaimed that. Grace and Anne both shook their heads slightly. Anne pursed her lips and said nothing, but Grace looked at Bessy with a frown. I don't know if it is.
Bessy.
The window lowered and Principal White was in the back seat, sitting sideways. Bessy let go and looked slightly pleased. She called, Principal White. Principal White looked at Bessy and thought of when Michael had come to find him. He knocked on his knee and was a little strange.
Are you going to eat? Get in. Let's go together.
His eyes were very mild and pure, like a kind elder. His tone was more like a polite question. Bessy shook her head. I want to buy books with my deskmate. The two said a few more words and the jeep drove away. Before they went far, Mary was already standing beside Bessy staring at her. When the car drove away, she still wasn't back to her senses and had to be dragged by Bessy. Bessy dragged Mary with one hand, put on her headphones again with the other, and adjusted the volume. Her eyes were still slightly red and she looked impatient and cold. She directly passed Grace and Elise, as if she didn't know them. Grace and Anne didn't speak to her, nor did they call her. Elise glanced at the window as the car passed by. The window was darkly tinted and she couldn't see who was inside. She knew that Bessy's recommendation letter had been written by Principal White. This was something she just couldn't figure out. This was the first time Elise had met Bessy, and she had to admit that she was beautiful. No wonder David's attitude towards Bessy was better than she had expected. Elise looked Bessy up and down again and examined her. When she judged people, she was always condescending. Anne noticed Elise's gaze and smiled. I heard that my sister was originally in our class, but our teacher was afraid that it would affect the learning of our class, so she didn't want her. Elise retracted her gaze. She hadn't really seen Bessy's resume, but she had heard about it. When she stayed in the Smith family's house, Aunt Ruth had told her a lot. She was deep in thought and looked away. She glanced slightly past Bessy, moved away and said, Let's go. From beginning to end, she didn't talk to Susan. Elise looked powerful, and Susan had wanted to call Bessy, but after seeing how Grace and the rest didn't even greet her, she was stunned and said nothing. Grace said something to Susan and then kept up with Elise. Susan stood behind them, watching Elise get in a black BMW. Her eyes lingered on the driver's hand. The driver had just picked up Anne's backpack, and it was obvious that there was a delicate and beautiful pink cup hanging on the edge of the backpack. The pink cup wasn't the same as the one Bessy used. Although it was good-looking, it didn't have a logo and it didn't look like a luxury item. It looked like the cups that Susan often saw in boutiques that weren't expensive. Susan suddenly felt a little lightheaded and a bit confused. The Smith family had bought such an expensive cup for Bessy, but why didn't they buy one for Anne? The school sent so much information, and the English teacher also asked us to buy extracurricular books. Mary finally regained her senses and went to find the books with Bessy. Mrs. Lewis taught several English classes. The English materials here were sold out. The manager asked them to come back tomorrow morning for a new batch. The bookstore was relatively quiet. Bessy's headphones were still hanging around her neck, but she didn't stuff them on her ears. She leaned against the bookshelf and found another foreign book. She held it in one hand and her voice was relaxed. "Let's go back." Mary was afraid that she wouldn't be able to buy the books tomorrow, so she asked the bookstore owner to keep 2 copies for her and paid the deposit before leaving. This bookstore was bigger than all the rest. As a result, the sound coming from the end of the alley seemed a little unclear. It was the voice of a few teenagers, and Bessy saw the corner of their clothes. They were red and black, not Brightbow High School's nor Baybridge High School's jacket. They were noisy and loud. Bessy shoved the earphones from her neck onto her ears. Mary was also a bit scared and she pulled on Bessy's sleeves. "Bessy, let's go back to school first." The group of teenagers in the alley seemed to stop, and one of them suddenly laughed.
Isn't this our classmate Scarlett? Yo, she's still wearing her high school jacket. Are you still in Brightbow High School?
His tone was very discomforting. Mary frowned. She dragged Bessy and wanted to tell the security guard about this when she got back to school. Within a few seconds, the annoying voice spoke again.
"Scarlett, you harmed me last time, and you can still attend Brightbow High School as if nothing happened? You're impressive, eh?"
Several Brightbow High School students trotted out of the alley in a panic. Mary froze. She dragged Bessy's hand and said in a tense tone, "Bessy, that's Scarlett?" She took out her cell phone, called the police first, and then went to the guard.
"Haha, Stephen, you're too much. Be careful. It's not good if the knife strikes the girl's face. Her face is really white."
Several bursts of laughter sounded. "Take it for me." Bessy handed the book in her hand to Mary, then cracked her neck and loosened the collar of her shirt. "I'll take a look." Mary looked at her calm face, told her not to mess around, and then ran to the school to find the security. The police would surely take a while to come. Bessy always kept in mind that she wanted her grandmother to spend a comfortable old age and not to worry about her. So, she had refrained from making trouble in Chicago. Until now. She watched Scarlett leaning against the wall, her glasses pulled down. She was cruelly thrown aside and her eyes enlarged like a thread puppet. Looking closely, there was panic in those eyes. The teenager with silver hair, called Steve, held Scarlett's face in one hand and a knife in his other, making a gesture at her face. Bang. Tense from the moment she'd arrived in Chicago, Bessy's tight nerves finally snapped. Someone noticed Bessy. A person with purple hair took the lead, noticing Bessy.
"What are you looking at?"
"I promised my grandmother to study hard and be a good person," Bessy whispered. She seemed to be in breach of her grandmother's agreement and couldn't be obedient. The man with purple hair was holding a cigarette and said in a vile voice,
"What are you looking at?"
Every scene flashed through her mind. Screams, explosions, blood soaking through the earth. Bessy took off her headphones and school jacket and tossed them aside. She looked up at the person called Steve, coldly and evilly. "Stephen Williams, do you remember me telling you to stay away from me?" She stepped forward, reached out, and grabbed the dagger in Stephen's hand. Blood ran down the palm of her hand, scaring the group of young people. The originally fierce teenagers calmed down at this moment and all looked at her. Stephen was startled and took a step back. He stared at her as his expression darkened, and a savage and aggressive look passed over her face. He loosened his dagger and assumed a combat posture. Bessy released his hand in a hurry. The dagger fell to the ground and clattered. She took a step back, widened her distance, and turned around to make a round kick on Stephen's chest. Thud. The person was taken down. The others reacted and rushed over. Bessy raised her other hand and pressed someone's hand, kicking him in the stomach at the same time.
"Bessy!"
Stephen pushed himself off the ground and spit out blood. He tried to climb up, but failed too. The siren sounded not far away. Bessy squeezed her right hand, put on her school jacket, and stood beside Stephen. She lowered her head and didn't pull her zipper, so her white coat was stained with bright red blood. She squatted and stepped on Stephen's hand. Her pretty eyes narrowed slightly, and she stretched out a white finger, then pressed it against Stephen's throat. She dragged out her tone pleasant. "Why didn't you listen to me?" Not far away, Anne had been walking with Grace and Elise, but she couldn't get the materials that Mrs. Lewis had wanted. She had the driver stop at the intersection. She had come down to buy the books, and the driver had first sent Grace to the hotel, not far away. Seeing this, Anne took a moment to look around and didn't go to the bookstore. Instead, she took out her phone and called Grace. "Mom!" Anne watched the police car parked not far away. Sister seemed to be fighting with someone and went to the police station. On the other side of the phone, Grace's expression changed. She took a step outside the hotel, and after making sure that Elise and David couldn't hear her, she whispered, "What the hell is going on?" Anne was also unclear, so she just said a few words in a vague manner.
"Don't tell your dad and your aunt about this. I'll go to the police station first."
Episode 35. The Truth. In the Chicago police station branch, a young policeman held a pen and sat opposite Bessy.
"Bessy, tell me your parents' contact information and why you hit those people."
Bessy leaned back in the chair and pinched her right hand. The blood leaked out and stained her school jacket. She had no expression on her face, and she said casually, "I didn't like the sight of them." The dispatch was near the school. The police had seen all kinds of offensive students here before, and with just one glance at Bessy, he could tell that she was a common offender.
"You beat him up just because of that?"
Soon, a list of injuries came out. At first glance, the police determined that the most severely beaten, Stephen, had to stay in the hospital for a few days. He patted the table. He had seen many cases like this, but he had never seen anyone who showed no signs of repentance after hitting someone. He sneered and was a little disgusted.
"Fine, you're from Brightbow High School, aren't you? I've already informed your school. At this rate, you will have to be detained. I'll wait for your parents to come."
Someone knocked on the door outside. "Reynolds, their family is here." Officer Leon Reynolds went out and happened to see Grace Smith. A policewoman was handing out a form for Grace to fill in. Seeing Officer Reynolds, Grace squeezed her bag. This was the first time she'd been here, and she felt uncomfortable all over.
"Police officer, I am Bessy's mother."
She was stiff and spoke anxiously.
"Officer Reynolds, where is she?"
Officer Reynolds glanced at her and took the list.
"She's under interrogation inside. What did you teach her as a mother?"
Grace was embarrassed about being lectured by the police officer, and she stood there stiffly. Everyone in the police station looked at her, but she didn't want to care about it for a moment. But Elise was still in Chicago, so many people in the Smith family knew of the existence of her eldest daughter and were waiting to gossip about her. If she didn't take care of it now, news of Bessy being detained in the police station would surely spread to the Smith family. Stephen was taken to the hospital because of some serious injuries, and the police took statements from others. Several other teenagers gave their statements. Only Scarlett did not speak. She kept her head buried in her knees and didn't listen to anyone.
"Your daughter is still inside. She's very stubborn and won't admit wrong or cooperate with us. She can only be detained if this goes on."
Officer Reynolds threw the list on the table. Grace's brain froze and she said,
"Officer Reynolds, let me in to persuade her."
A smartly dressed old lady came in from the gate and groaned as she entered.
Who hit my grandson? Where is my grandson? Where is he?"
When Grace saw the old lady, she was stunned.
"Grandma Williams?"
She had previously found a violin teacher for Bessy, and this grandmother was that teacher's mother. The old lady was anxious about her grandson. She heard Grace's voice and narrowed her eyes to look at her. It took her a while to recognize her.
"Grandma Williams, let's discuss things slowly. How much do you want?"
Grace lowered her head and murmured in a low voice. Her brain crashed. Would she go to jail? Then criminal records would be left behind. No way.
Who wants your money? Said the old lady with a sharp tongue. She called her family again. What are you still looking at? Your son has been beaten and sent to the hospital. Call the officer at once. She was really looking for death. In the school medical office, Samuel looked out the door again and touched his ear studs.
Why hasn't Bessy come yet?
Michael glanced at him and said nothing. He continued reading the medical book in his hand with his head lowered. His knuckles were obvious as he wrote in the book. Samuel watched him sullenly. He would see how long he could stand it for. 5 minutes later, Michael raised his head, put the pen aside, and closed the book in his hand. He took out his phone and glanced at it. There was no new message displayed on it. It was still the text message sent by Bessy 10 minutes ago. I have matters to settle. I'm taking leave. The sentence was like a stone sinking into the ocean. Michael furrowed his brows. He only received a call from the school when he was about to start eating. He rose suddenly. Samuel, holding his fork, was stunned.
Michael, where are you going? She's at the police station.
Michael took his coat and walked out the door, looking down at the number on his mobile phone. Samuel stopped smiling after hearing this and was shocked as well. He shot up straight.
Police station?
Samuel naturally knew that the her that Michael was talking about was Bessy. He put down his fork and got up.
Why is she in there?
Michael didn't know the situation, so he only motioned for him to get the car key.
I asked Rick Soup to come.
Marvin Clark followed behind them expressionlessly. He knew who Rick was. He was Robert Soup's uncle. He had heard before that Rick had been assigned to some third-tier city by Robert. It turned out to be Chicago. But was it really necessary to call him here? Such a tiny matter, like a fight among high school students, actually required Rick to come here and use a sledgehammer on a nut? A restaurant box sat in the middle.
They're all at Bright Bow High School. Why didn't they bring Bessy along?
David smiled.
I heard her mother say that she's very popular in school.
Upset, the cup in Anne's hand shook against the edge of the table.
Anne, your mother said that she had matters to attend to, but why is she so late?
David heard the sound of the cup and looked over to ask. He waited for a while and didn't see Grace coming back. Anne held her fork, lowered her eyes, and bit her lip. She should be at the police station.
Police station?
David froze and unconsciously dropped the menu. Elise also looked up. My sister just fought with someone at school and was taken to the police station by the police. I'm afraid that something happened to them. Anne sighed. David stood up and frowned.
Nothing will happen. I'll go.
Before he finished speaking and stood up, Thomas, who had just come in, got up and wiped his hands with a paper towel.
Dad, you can eat with Auntie first. I'll go to the police station.
Thomas was also a respectable man in Chicago. His connections weren't worse than his father's. David hesitated and then nodded.
Okay, then you go and see. Call me if something happens.
Anne looked at Thomas's back. She had never seen Thomas so concerned before. Dad, I'm a bit worried about my mother and sister. Let me go with my brother.
Be careful.
David thought for a while, but did not refuse. The police station. Hearing Grandmother Williams' words, Grace panicked. Once those people were really involved, how could she cope with it? She asked the officer to take her to see Bessy.
Her child was injured badly by your daughter. When we arrived, his arms were already limp, and his injury appraisal has yet to come out.
Officer Reynolds glanced at Grace.
If they investigate it, she won't be able to get away with less than 2 years in jail.
Grace opened the door uneasily. Bessy had one hand on the table and the other supporting her chin. Her eyes were closed. When she heard the police, she opened her eyes slightly. When she saw who it was, she changed her posture anxiously. Why are you here? She hadn't told them Grace's number. She naturally had a way to solve this matter.
Bessy, why can't you just study well? The person you hit is Stephen. Mr. Williams has taught you well. How could you do this?
Grace gritted her teeth. If she could turn back time to the beginning of school, even if James didn't want her, she would never have brought Bessy back.
Do you know that you'll have to go to jail if they investigate? Your whole future will be ruined.
Bessy leaned back and smirked indifferently, eyes still bloodshot. She still looked cynical and nonchalant. Oh, she said simply. Grace closed her eyes.
Go and apologize to Grandma Williams and Mr. Williams right away. It's better if they don't pursue this matter. If they do—"
Grace pursed her lips. After this matter had blown over, she would send her abroad. Leaving her in Chicago was a disaster waiting to happen.
"My face in the Smith family's house has been lost because of you, Bessy."
Outside the door, several police officers didn't dare to take up the matter. Grandma Williams had said that she was looking for the bureau. When it came to the bureau, these civilian police officers simply didn't dare to mess around. They waited anxiously. Grace came out with Bessy and wanted to apologize to Grandma Williams and the teenagers. The main office room wasn't big and was almost full. Grace put down her pride and went to appease Grandma Williams. Since coming to Chicago so long ago, she had been careful in everything she did, and she had never put down her pride before.
"What you say is useless now. My grandson is still in the hospital,"
Grandma Williams said fiercely at Bessy.
"We will definitely pursue this matter to the end."
Grace was at her wit's end. She could only step on her pride and call David for help. Just before calling, she got a call from Thomas. At this time, most people in the police station were off work. Thomas was tall and slender and had a strong presence that stood out among a group of people. At first glance, it was obvious he wasn't an ordinary person. He looked around and saw Bessy standing in the crowd. She was leaning against the wall with her lips pursed indifferently. Thomas paused and then took 2 steps towards them, stopping beside Grace.
"Aunt, what's going on?"
Grace opened her mouth, but she was reassured now. She was very clear about her stepson's ability. Thomas asked the police some questions.
"You are all Bessy's family?"
Grandma Williams stared sharply at Thomas.
"Let me tell you, there is no way I will let her go. My grandson's hand was broken by her and he's still in the emergency room. She must go to jail."
"We have investigated this matter already. They are all students. The impact on them won't be good."
Thomas didn't know the specific reason and was patient and calm. Several other parents who were angry over their injured children also rushed over. They all started talking at once after knowing their sons had been injured.
"She's so young, but so cruel. How did you even teach her? Which parent would dare to let her study and stay in school? She looks like a vixen. How good of a person can she be?
She must pay for this."
They were unwilling to let this matter go. Amidst this noisiness, Anne pulled Thomas's clothes from behind and smiled obediently. "Uncles and aunts, I believe that my sister isn't such an unreasonable person. She must have some unspoken reason. Brother, mother, since they're unwilling to let it go, then let's publicize this matter."
"No way,"
Grace immediately retorted. Grace had a splitting headache. She knew just how many times Bessy had fought. This time, she knew that it must be Bessy who had caused trouble first. If this matter was publicized, she would really have to go to jail. There were too many people in the police station. Thomas glanced at Bessy. She had her head lowered and didn't say a single word to justify herself. She was really indifferent. Thomas took out his phone and called Jacob Grant.
"Is it wrong to apologize for your wrongdoings?"
Grace reached out and dragged Bessy.
"Didn't your grandmother teach you?"
Anne stood behind Grace and pursed her lips. The office hall was in chaos. Grandma Williams tried to beat Bessy, but was stopped by the police. In the mess, a girl who had been squatting in the corner suddenly stood up. Bessy saw her. "Scarlett, go back." Scarlett didn't look at her and calmly said, "There is indeed an unspoken reason. If you want to publicize it, then I will too. May I ask the police officer what crime it is to beat up and molest an underage girl?" After she said this, the parents, Grandma Williams, and even the police officers were all stunned.